One moment, she was laughing, thinking she pulled off a harmless joke. The next, she was getting fined and escorted away by police. And trust me, you're going to want to hear how this one played out. The morning air outside Buckingham Palace was crisp, the kind of London chill that felt just a little fancier when you were standing in front of royalty. Well, royal property at least. A steady crowd had gathered, tourists from all over the world, cameras at the ready, waiting for their glimpse of the famous British royal guards. Their stoic presence, their unwavering stillness, the sheer discipline. It was a spectacle, a tradition centuries old. And then came her. She stormed up to the gates like she owned them, her expensive handbag swinging with every exaggerated step. She was dressed in what could only be described as entitled tourist chic. Oversized sunglasses despite the overcast sky, a loud designer-patterned top, and the telltale sign of impending chaos, an aggressively clenched phone in one hand. This wasn't a woman who enjoyed waiting. This wasn't a woman used to being ignored. And today, of all days, she had decided that she was going to be noticed. The line of tourists waiting to take their turns near the fence barely had time to process what was happening before she made her grand entrance, by shoving her way to the front with the grace of a bulldozer. Excuse me. I don't have all day," she huffed, elbowing a baffled couple who had been quietly admiring the view. "Some of us have real schedules to keep. Move." A murmur of disbelief spread through the crowd as people exchanged glances. Was she serious? She was. With one final push, she secured her rightful place against the black and gold gates of Buckingham Palace, positioning herself directly in front of one of the royal guard's standing posts. The man in uniform didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't even breathe differently. And that drove her insane. For a solid 5 seconds, she stood there, waiting for him to react. Nothing. No side-eye. No flicker of movement. Not even a twitch of the lip. That was when the complaint started. "Oh, so what? You're just going to stand there?" she scoffed, folding her arms. "That's your whole job? What? Are you too good to talk to people?" No response. The tourists around her, some already recording, others just morbidly fascinated, watched as she started to ramp up. "I just think it's ridiculous," she continued, her voice rising. "I paid thousands of dollars to come here. Thousands. I should at least get some customer service." A woman nearby snorted. "Ma'am," a man next to her whispered, attempting to spare her from further embarrassment. "They're not supposed to talk." "Wrong move." Karen snapped her head in his direction. "Oh, so you work here? You work for the Queen?" He blinked. No, I just—" "Then maybe don't tell me what they can and can't do," she snapped, flipping her hair. "I know how service works. They're obviously just being rude." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like bad perfume. The royal guards, the literal king's guard, being rude? At this point, even the children in the crowd were side-eyeing her. Karen, however, was fully convinced she was in the right. In her mind, this was the epitome of poor customer service. She was a paying tourist, and these employees were blatantly ignoring her. No greetings, no smiles, no acknowledgement of her presence, her importance. And that was unacceptable. "Hello." She waved her manicured hand an inch from the soldier's face. No reaction. Wow. Okay, so this is what passes for security? Unreal. I should talk to management. Somewhere in the back, someone wheezed, trying not to laugh. She turned back toward the crowd, as if expecting support. "You know, in America, we don't treat people like this." A British woman near the gate deadpanned. "Good thing you're not in America, then." Karen gasped so dramatically that even the pigeons took flight. "Rude," she barked at the woman before whipping back toward the royal guard. "I don't care if this is your job, or whatever. It is incredibly unprofessional to just ignore people." Her rant was starting to draw even more attention now. Tourists were leaning in, whispering, phones discreetly held at their sides, wondering how much worse this was going to get. The answer? A lot. Because at that moment, Karen had a brilliant idea. If he wouldn't respond to words, she'd just have to force a reaction. And that's when she set her sights on his hat. Would he ignore her then? Would he still just stand there if she snatched it right off his head? Her lips curled into a mischievous smirk, completely unaware that in just a few moments, she was about to regret every single decision that had led her to this moment. Karen was fuming. How dare this so-called guard continue ignoring her like she was some common tourist? Didn't he know who she was? Okay, sure, maybe he didn't technically know who she was, but that wasn't the point. The point was, she had spent thousands of dollars flying to this country, and she deserved the royal treatment. And yet, Here she was being blatantly ignored by some guy playing dress-up in a ridiculous uniform. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. He was doing this on purpose, and she wasn't going to stand for it. The realization hit her like an epiphany. If words weren't going to get a reaction, she'd just have to take things up a notch. Her eyes zeroed in on the tall, black bearskin hat perched atop the guard's head. It was massive, almost comically so, like some outdated relic from a bad costume drama. She narrowed her gaze. Surely this was the key. He could ignore her words. He could ignore her gestures. But could he ignore this? The answer to that was something Karen intended to find out. With a smug smirk curling at her lips, she reached up. The moment was almost surreal, like a scene unfolding in slow motion. The tourists watching had a split-second realization of what was about to happen, but it was too late to stop her. Her manicured fingers brushed against the edge of the bearskin hat, and that's when all hell broke loose. The instant her hand made contact, the guard moved. It happened so fast that she didn't even register it at first. 1 second, she was smugly reaching for the hat, expecting that he'd finally break character, that he'd gasp in horror and reprimand her, that he'd acknowledge her existence in some way. The next second, boom, a deafening stamp of a polished black boot slammed into the pavement, just inches from where she stood. Stand back. The command rang out like a thunderclap, the sheer force of it rattling her bones. Karen actually stumbled backward, her sunglasses slipping down her nose. The guard's voice was sharp, commanding, absolute, the kind of voice that didn't ask twice. The tourists watching, dead silent. Karen? Frozen. For the first time since she had stomped her way up to the gate, she looked genuinely uncertain. But her hesitation lasted only a second, because in Karen's mind, she had just been screamed at. How dare he? She wasn't the problem. He was. Her face contorted into an expression of indignant rage. Excuse me, did you just yell at me? The guard didn't move. He had returned to absolute stillness, as if the moment hadn't even happened, which, somehow, only made her angrier. You have no right to talk to me like that, she shrieked, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at his face. That was completely uncalled for. I was just having a little fun. I barely even touched you. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh, she's done for." Karen's rage was boiling over. The embarrassment of being publicly put in her place, the humiliation of being ignored and then shouted at. She wasn't going to let this go. You just assaulted me, she bellowed. A collective blink from the crowd. What? Someone whispered. I was just trying to get your attention. You didn't have to attack me like that. I could have died. Died? From what? A firmly planted footstep and a loud voice? The crowd was struggling to hold back laughter, but Karen was fully committed to her performance. Her chest heaved as she whipped her phone out, jabbing at the screen with manic fury. That's IT. I'm calling the police, she shrieked. You're going to be arrested for assaulting me. A wave of hushed whispers rippled through the onlookers. Someone finally spoke up. Ma'am, you're the one who touched him. Karen whirled around, eyes wild. And who are you? Some random person? Stay out of this. The man lifted his hands in surrender. I mean, sure. But, you know that touching a royal guard is like literally illegal, right? Karen scoffed. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But deep down, somewhere beneath her towering entitlement, a tiny seed of doubt had been planted. Her fingers hovered over the call button. Then, as if the universe had perfect comedic timing, a police officer just happened to be patrolling near the palace gates at that exact moment. Karen's eyes lit up. Officer, she shrieked, waving her arms like a stranded hiker in the wilderness. Officer, help. I've just been attacked. The tourists collectively exhaled. Oh, this was about to get good. The officer, a stout man with the patience of a saint, strolled over, clearly confused. Ma'am, he said calmly, what seems to be the issue? Karen squared her shoulders, fully preparing for her grand moment of justice. That man just assaulted me, she declared, pointing an accusing finger at the royal guard. The officer's gaze followed her finger, landed on the guard, and stayed there. There was a brief pause. Then, a single eyebrow lifted. Pardon. The tourists held their breath. And just like that, Karen's day was about to get a whole lot worse. The moment the officer's eyebrow lifted in silent what now? Energy. Karen's mouth was already running at full speed. That man, she jabbed a finger toward the royal guard like a prosecutor delivering a damning piece of evidence, just attacked me. He screamed in my face, stomped at me, and nearly knocked me over. I demand you do something about it. The tourists were struggling to keep straight faces. The officer, who had clearly seen some things in his career, took a deep breath. "Ma'am, are you referring to this guard?" He gestured at the royal guard, who still stood like a statue, back in his rigid, unshakable stance, as if this whole situation was beneath his notice. "Yes," Karen shrieked, her cheeks reddening with rage. "He is completely out of control." The officer let out a slow, measured exhale. "Ma'am, did you at any point touch the guard?" Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake. I barely did anything. I was just trying to get his attention because he was ignoring me. That hat is so stupidly tall. I just wanted to, see if it was as ridiculous up close." The officer nodded. "So you did touch him." "I touched a hat." "A hat?" She spat, throwing her arms up in frustration. "Not a person," one of the tourists murmured under their breath. "Oh, she is so cooked." The officer, without changing his expression, simply turned to the guard. "Sir, do you require assistance?" For the first time since the entire ordeal began, the guard moved, and everyone felt it. The imposing figure of the royal guard, who had remained stoic and unmoving through Karen's tirade, suddenly snapped to life with precision. In a motion so swift it was almost jarring, his boots slammed down onto the pavement with a sharp, thunderous boom. "Stand back!" The roar of his voice shook the air, so ferocious, so authoritative, so absolute that it rattled Karen down to her overpriced handbag. The tourists gasped. "Karen?" Karen actually flinched. For the first time since she stormed her way up to the gates, she looked genuinely scared. Her entire body jolted backward from the force of the command, her sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. But the guard wasn't done. With military precision, he performed the textbook maneuver designed for handling intruders, a disciplined movement meant to force a hostile individual out of his immediate space. His body shifted, his polished black boots stamping down again in another earth-shaking stomp, this time angled toward her direction. A move designed to intimidate, not harm, but Karen didn't know that. The shockwave of the motion alone sent Karen into a full-blown stumble. Her heels slipped, her arms flailed, and before she could regain balance, she toppled backward with all the grace of an inflatable tube man in a windstorm. Thud! A collective gasp from the onlookers. Karen, now sitting on the pavement, blinked in stunned disbelief. It was as if the reality of her actions had, just now, in this humiliating moment, begun to register. The officer, meanwhile, remained completely unfazed. He had seen dozens of these situations play out before, entitled tourists getting a little too bold and learning, in real time, that royal guards were not theme park employees. He tilted his head slightly, watching Karen as she sat frozen in her own embarrassment. "Ma'am," he said, in the most deadpan voice imaginable, "you were given a direct command to stand back." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her brain was short-circuiting between the anger, the humiliation, and the sheer audacity of this so-called guard treating her like she wasn't important. And she just couldn't accept that. But before she could launch into another tirade, something horrifying caught her attention. People were laughing, not just chuckling, not just smirking, straight-up belly laughing. She snapped her head toward the crowd of tourists surrounding the scene. People from all over the world, watching, whispering, and grinning at her like she was some kind of spectacle. It was unbearable. "Oh, you think this is funny?" she shrieked, her voice hitting octaves that should have been illegal in public spaces. A few people had the nerve to actually nod. The heat in her face intensified to volcanic levels. "This is harassment," she screeched, still sitting on the pavement like a toddler mid-tantrum. The officer sighed, clearly done with this whole situation. "Ma'am," he said bluntly, "you are currently trespassing on restricted grounds and have made physical contact with a royal guard. You are in violation of multiple laws. Do you really want to continue this conversation?" The second the word laws left his lips, Karen froze. The color drained from her face faster than a bucket with no bottom. The tourists held their breath. The guard? Completely unfazed. Karen's entire demeanor shifted. "Wait, what? Laws?" Her voice cracked, her earlier confidence crumbling like a dry cookie. "Yes," the officer repeated, his tone exceedingly patient. "Did you not know that touching a royal guard is an arrestable offense?" Karen palpitated. "Arrestable?" She looked around, almost as if expecting someone to bail her out. The tourists had zero sympathy. The officer folded his arms. "So, do you still want to file that report, ma'am?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. But nothing came out. For the first time in possibly her entire life, she was speechless. The tourists were eating this up. The guard, meanwhile, had already gone back to his neutral stance, as if the whole ordeal was so insignificant that it wasn't even worth acknowledging anymore. And that burned Karen more than anything. But she wasn't done yet. Oh no, she was about to make this so much worse for herself. Karen, still sitting on the pavement, her face twisted in a storm of rage and humiliation, yanked her phone from her handbag with all the grace of a toddler flinging a toy during a meltdown. The tourists watched enthralled. This was entertainment gold. "That's IT," she screeched, furiously punching numbers into her phone. "I'm calling the police." A collective wave of stifled laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered from the back, "This just keeps getting better." The officer, who had already dealt with one Karen too many in his lifetime, raised an unimpressed eyebrow. "Ma'am." But Karen wasn't listening. She pressed the phone to her ear and dramatically announced in her best victim voice, "Hello. Yes, I'd like to report a violent attack." The crowd collectively blinked. Even the officer, whose patience had been Olympic level up to this point, let out a long, audible sigh. The Royal Guard, still unshaken, still standing like a statue, as if Karen's entire existence was beneath his notice. That, of course, only infuriated her more. She shot him a withering glare before dramatically turning away, as if he was too disgusting to look at. "Yes," she continued, now pacing wildly. "I was just attacked at Buckingham Palace. A so-called guard screamed in my face and threw me to the ground." The tourists audibly gasped, but not from shock. From second-hand embarrassment. "He assaulted me," Karen shrieked. "I could have been killed." The officer pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am," he tried again, "you may want to reconsider." Karen threw up her hand in his face. "I am speaking to the authorities. Thank you." The officer gave the Royal Guard a slow glance, as if silently asking, "How do you people not quit?" The guard, of course, didn't move, because he didn't have to. Karen continued her over-the-top performance into the phone. "Yes, I'm still at the scene of the crime. I expect an immediate arrest. You should send multiple units." Someone snorted. "Multiple units?" A teenager muttered to their friend. "She thinks she's in a movie." Another tourist chimed in, barely containing their laughter. "Someone get this woman an Oscar." Karen spun around, eyes blazing. "This is not funny. You people are witnesses. You saw everything." A bold, elderly man from the crowd raised his hand. "Yes, we did, and we saw you try to steal a Royal Guard's hat." A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. Karen's face went pale. That's not what happened," she shrieked. "You're all lying." The officer exchanged looks with some of the tourists, then turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, are you sure you want to continue this report?" Karen squared her shoulders. "Oh, I am beyond sure. This psychopath should be in cuffs." The officer sighed. "All right then. I hope you're ready for the consequences of wasting police time." Karen ignored him, standing smugly as if she had already won. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens cut through the London air. Karen's smug smile widened. "Finally," she huffed. "Now let's see this disgrace of a guard talk his way out of this." The crowd? Oh, they were ready, because they already knew Karen was about to dig her own grave deeper than ever before. The police car rolled up to Buckingham Palace's grand entrance, sirens fading as two officers stepped out. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions unreadable, but the moment their eyes landed on Karen, who stood smugly tapping her foot, a silent, shared exhaustion passed between them. They already knew. Karen launched into her performance immediately. "OH, thank God you're here." She flung an arm toward the Royal Guard, still standing unshaken in his post. "That monster assaulted me." The lead officer, a seasoned veteran of nonsense, simply blinked at her. The second officer, clearly younger and new to handling Karens, glanced at his partner, as if to say, "Is this really happening?" The crowd? Silent. Watching. Waiting. This was the moment they'd all been dying to witness. "All right, ma'am." The lead officer sighed, pulling out his notepad. "Let's start from the beginning. What exactly happened?" Karen squared her shoulders, her inner soap opera actress emerging. "It was horrific," she gasped, clutching her chest like she had barely survived a war. The younger officer stifled a cough. "He screamed at me for no reason." Karen continued, waving her hands wildly in the air. "I was just standing here, minding my own business, when he attacked me. I was terrified for my life." The crowd collectively raised eyebrows. A man from the back muttered, "She was laughing when she did it." Karen spun around. Liar. The lead officer sighed harder. And what exactly did he do? Karen took a deep, exaggerated breath. He threw me to the ground. The crowd murmured. He screamed in my face and shoved me. Karen continued. I could have died. This is abuse. He should be arrested immediately. The younger officer, still fighting a smirk, glanced at the royal guard, who hadn't moved a muscle. Ma'am, he said, keeping his voice painfully neutral. Did you touch the guard? Karen's face froze. The energy shifted. Her eyes darted sideways. What? No, of course not. The lead officer sighed. Ma'am, I need you to be honest. I am being honest. Karen snapped. What kind of question is that? The older officer exchanged a look with his partner. Then, with almost theatrical timing, he lifted his radio and spoke calmly into it. Control, do we have surveillance footage available from a scene? Karen's entire body stiffened. The crowd? Oh, they were eating this up. A crackle of static. Then a smooth affirmative came through the radio. Confirmed. CCTV footage is clear. Reviewing now. Karen swallowed. But before she could speak, the radio crackled again. Control to responding officers. Please advise the complainant that she's the one violating protocol. Confirmed. She attempted to take the guard's hat. The crowd erupted. A mixture of gasps, snickers, and whispers of I knew it rippled through the onlookers. Karen's jaw dropped. The officers? Fully unfazed. Ma'am, the lead officer said, his voice now bored. You're aware that touching a royal guard is a serious offense? Karen's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. What? That's ridiculous. It's not, actually, the officer continued, flipping through his notepad. Royal Guard are considered active-duty military. Interfering with them is punishable by law. I didn't interfere, Karen snapped. I was just... The officer didn't wait for her to finish. Ma'am, you're being issued a fine of £500 for violating Royal Guard protocol and causing a public disturbance. The crowd roared. Karen's face drained of color. £500, she shrieked. For what? I was the victim. Doesn't look that way, the younger officer murmured under his breath. You can't do this. Karen stamped her foot. This is a scam. I'm an American citizen. That's nice, the officer replied dryly. You still broke UK law. The older officer turned to the younger one. Escort her off the premises. No, you can't do this. I demand to speak to. But before she could finish, the officer firmly gestured toward the edge of the palace gates. Ma'am, leave. Now. The crowd cheered. A group of tourists actually clapped. A few people waved goodbye. Karen, flushed with humiliation, turned and stormed away, but not before one last pathetic outburst. This country is a joke. As she disappeared down the street, someone in the crowd called out cheerfully, Enjoy your fine, love. The crowd laughed. The officers exchanged amused glances. And the Royal Guard? Still standing, unbothered, untouchable. Karen stormed away from Buckingham Palace, her face red, her fists clenched, and her expensive designer bag swinging wildly with every angry stomp. The sheer audacity of it all, being fined like some common criminal, being escorted away like some hooligan. She seethed. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. She had dreamed of this moment. She had pictured herself sipping tea inside Buckingham Palace, taking VIP tours, maybe even brushing shoulders with royalty. Instead, she was leaving with a £500 fine and an audience of tourists laughing at her expense. Her heels clicked furiously against the pavement as she muttered under her breath. This country is insane. Unbelievable. I should SUE. I should call the embassy. No, I should, Behind her, Buckingham Palace remained untouched, regal, and unbothered. The Royal Guard resumed his post, standing just as still and composed as ever, as if the last 20 minutes of absolute chaos hadn't even happened. The tourists who had witnessed the spectacle were still buzzing with amusement. Did she actually think she could get away with that? One man whispered, shaking his head. A woman laughed. She looked so confident, too, like she thought she was going to walk away as the hero. I bet she tells everyone a completely different story when she gets home, someone else snorted. A small round of applause erupted from a few spectators, directed at the Royal Guard. Even though he didn't react, everyone knew this moment would go down in their memories as the time they saw Karen try to challenge a literal soldier and fail spectacularly. Meanwhile, Karen's rage continued to boil as she power-walked through the streets of London. This was supposed to be the best trip ever, she hissed under her breath. I planned this for months. I bought all the best outfits. I was supposed to have the perfect palace experience. She glanced down at her phone, considering calling her husband back in the States to rant about the absolutely appalling treatment she had received. But then she remembered. He was the one who told her not to cause a scene. Oh, he was going to be furious. She could already hear his voice. You what? You grabbed the guard hat. Karen, are you insane? That's literally illegal. How much was the fine? Karen grimaced. Yeah, maybe that was a conversation for later. She reached into her bag, pulled out her sunglasses, and shoved them onto her face, attempting to mask her humiliation. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, London itself was mocking her. Every time she passed a smirking local, she wondered, were they there? Did they see it? Every time she heard a whisper or a snicker, she tensed. Were they talking about her? And worst of all, every time she saw a royal guard station somewhere else, she had the distinct, gut-wrenching feeling that they knew exactly what she had done. Her dream of a luxury palace experience had crumbled into public humiliation, a dent in her bank account, and a personal reminder that some rules, especially ones involving the British military, are not meant to be broken. And as for Buckingham Palace, the gates remained locked, the guards remained standing, and the legacy of their discipline remained untouchable, just as it had for centuries before, and just as it would for centuries after.